Here we are again. Jonathan Rigby speaking, author of English Gothic. I have Pete Walker with me. I think it's about time we talk about Barry Evans.
Yeah.
Because obviously he was difficult at the time and a troubled young man, and he was.
But you could handle him on his own.
Right.
You know, I mean, any of them you could handle on their own. It's just when they all got together.
Right. That's the trouble.
This is like the Sex Pistols.
Well, he was born in Guildford, I believe, in June 1943, and went to the Central School of Speech and Drama. And, like Christopher Sandford, had appeared in Wesker plays, and subsequently at the National Theatre, in The Royal Hunt of the Sun, and had been directed by Zeffirelli and what have you. And it was from his stuff at the National Theatre that Clive Donner selected him for Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, in which he'd been surrounded by all these generic 60s dolly birds, as they were called then. And, of course, later in his career, when he was doing lots of sitcoms, he actually did a newspaper interview in which he talked about his troubled relationship with women, and the fact that he'd been in love with Judy Geeson and whoever else, and a number of others. And there were some complaints from them, because they remembered things rather differently to the way he remembered them. He got quite a lot of complaint from these people like Judy Geeson. Yeah. But nonetheless, after Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, of course, he immediately plunged into playing Michael Upton in Doctor in the House.
Yeah. Well, he had a successful sitcom career.
But he did feel very strongly that it kind of... Because I think women apparently found him quite a sex object, because he was very... They wanted to mother him, I think was his idea, because he was very vulnerable. And he was literally vulnerable because his... I think he'd been abandoned by his mother and brought up in a Twickenham children's home. And didn't have a good time at school either, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So he was very
he was
troubled.
He was troubled,
seems to have been.
and known to be, and known to be sort of difficult, but handleable. I mean, but so many people, I mean, without naming other names, I mean, so many people that I used had reputations for being difficult. And when they worked with me, they were like pussycats.
Was that was your influence?
I don't know. Sorry? Particularly some of the older actors, they said, he's very difficult if things are wrong. I never had one crossword or one difficult any problem at all with any of them.
Well, by the late 70s, he was appearing in another very famous sitcom, which buoyed him along for quite a few years, Mind Your Language, in which he played a teacher of English as a foreign language. And, of course, that series is now considered a little dodgy, because we're a bit more racially sensitive now, apparently. Though apparently it's very popular in third world countries, so, go figure. That just shows you, doesn't it? But at that time, in the late 70s, reflecting on his difficult reputation, back in the early 70s, he said, I felt in those days that you shouldn't have to do things like publicity and personal appearances. You should be judged entirely on your acting. But I've mellowed now, and I realise that publicity is all part of it. And it's not fair on other people involved with a show to be a recluse. Well, interestingly enough, he ended up as a recluse.
Yes.
And also in 1978, he talking about his troubled relations, he said, I don't get married because I don't think marriage is an enviable state, and the thought of a little offspring horrifies me. It might look like me, and I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. I don't like myself very much physically. For one thing, I've got moles all over me. Imagine a poor little girl with a big mole on her nose being nicknamed Moley like I was. I hated it. I wouldn't want a child to go through that. So, his last two films were both sex films. Under the Doctor, which I guess was a reflection back on his Doctor in the House celebrity, and Adventures of a Taxi Driver for Stanley Long. But ironically, a taxi driver is exactly what he ended up being. He retired to, Claybrook Magna, which I believe is in Leicestershire. I hope I've got that right. And in February 1997, he was found dead in his bungalow under suspicious circumstances, and subsequently 3 teenagers were found in possession of his white Austin Montego taxi. And they were arrested, in point of fact. And it was quite sad. Some of the obituaries make quite sad reading, and there are quotes from his neighbours. One of his neighbours said he was quiet, but everyone liked him. I remembered him from Mind Your Language and was gobsmacked when I saw him sitting in one of our cabs. That was one of the people working at the taxi firm. And his own agent, Malcolm Knight, of Malone and Knight, said, having been so immensely well known as a cheerful charmer, he never shook off that image. He wanted to be accepted for roles more in keeping with his real age, but whenever people heard his name, they had a fixed picture in their mind. Eventually, he decided he wanted to give up show business, though recently he had been talking about trying to make a comeback. So it's one of those sad stories again, where somebody is on the cusp of making a comeback, and then they're snuffed out. It's a strange thing, and it was particularly a sad end.
Salminio.
Yes, there's another one. Yeah. Well, he was knifed, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But yes, found dead in this apparently slightly dilapidated bungalow, and apparently he'd worked for a taxi firm, but over the last 12 months he started up his own taxi firm called Barry's, which is effectively just him, I believe. So obviously he was never, without wishing to be muckraking about it, but he was never content with his lot or himself.
No, I mean, I said Salminio because there was a similarity. I knew Sal very well. He was an old friend, and there was a kind of similarity between Sal and Barry Evans.
Yeah, well, he did have a very soft and appealing and sort of vulnerable quality, which, as you pointed out, is really quite wrong for this alto saxophonist sort of cool guy.
Yeah,
and you'd be better off with somebody more hunky like McShane or what have you. But yes, well, that's a shame. I mean, he was finally thinking of making a comeback because he'd done quite a lot of distinguished theatrical work before the sitcom Celebrity. And he could have perhaps gone back to that.
But the trouble was, Barry was very much, I think, a man of his time. I mean, he wouldn't have. You couldn't really imagine Barry Evans as a 50-year-old.
One of those guys.
He was a 25-year-old.
Yes.
Did you see her face when you told me?
And that's the way he'd have had to stay.
Come on.
Well, in fact, his Guardian obituary is quite unequivocal about his life. Perhaps tragedy had always stalked him. Though born in comfortably middle-class Guildford, he was nevertheless in a Twickenham orphanage until he was 17. Though he won a John Gielgud scholarship to the Central School, his life ended before he could achieve many roles of the sort that would have impressed his patron. His was indeed a story of youthful innocence gorged and then destroyed. It's a slightly melodramatic way of putting it, perhaps. But it's a sad story.
Yeah.
Not an unusual story, perhaps. If somebody is vividly identified with a particular type of role at the very beginning of their career, then they're not allowed to age. It's something that generally happens more to women, of course, than to men, but curiously it happened to Barry Evans. Well, most of the dramatis personae are now dead,
Yes.
so it could be a reasonable indication that the film is drawing to a close.